Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. On the program today, we'll be talking to a very special guest, former Foreign Secretary, veteran diplomat, and someone who has served as India's ambassador to China. This, as a critically important new book, looks at the India China present through the prism of the past. Let's bring up our newsmaker on the program today. We're looking at the tale of India and China's relationship as it goes back to the 1950s. In fact, a brand new book, The Fractured Himalaya by Nirupama Rao, traces the origins and the genesis of this conflict. So much of what we read in the headlines today can actually be traced right back to history. Nehru is often criticized and vilified even for mishandling the crisis and the relationship with China. But what can India's present learn from India's past? The Fractured Himalaya tries to locate the present within the framework of the past, and the striking parallels really are staggering. To talk about the past, the present, and the future of the India China conflict, we're joined by former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao, the author of a meticulously researched, extremely important book for anybody interested in India, China, and the geopolitics of the region. It's a pleasure to have you, as always, on the program with us, ma'am. Going through the book, I was struck by the fact that this could be, if you took away the years that you're actually looking at, this could in some ways read as a book about India's present instead of India's past. That's how striking the parallels are. Did that strike you while you were, sort of researching and writing this book?
Thank you, Barkha, for having me on your show. It's wonderful to see you once again, although virtually. I wrote the book because having been a practitioner, been a diplomat practitioner, I'm not a historian in the academic sense, but I just felt that everything about the present of the India-China relationship today has its origins in the past. You cannot disconnect the past. And in fact, my book begins with this quotation from Alexis de Tocqueville, which says, "When the past no longer illuminates the future, the spirit walks in darkness." So my idea was that I write this book, especially with the 60th anniversary of the India-China conflict of 1962 coming up next year, just a few months away. Secondly, I wanted also, apart from writing it to coincide with the 60th anniversary, to help make a younger generation, which was not around in 1962, aware of the complexities of this relationship and the fact that you cannot draw simplistic deductions or conclusions about the situation as we confront it today.
It is actually fascinating, and we talk so much about Tibet today, but Tibet is mostly discussed as a kind of short-term provocation when you want to leverage something with the Chinese. When we
True.
go through your book, you actually identify 1950 as a point of departure. You talk about this relationship that has a certain degree of overt amiability, about Vijayalakshmi Pandit's delegation to China, and I'll come to that, a very interesting conversation with Mao Zedong. But 1950, as you describe it, that point of departure when the PLA troops actually enter Tibet. Talk a little bit about that moment being almost like this landmark moment that recalibrated the relationship forever.
Yes, Barkha. Until 1950, Tibet, especially from 1911, from the early 1900s onwards, had enjoyed what the Dalai Lama likes to call a de facto independence. Not that any country in the world had regarded Tibet as a sovereign, independent entity, but the practice was to deal with the Tibetan uh, authorities in Lhasa as if they were a sovereign entity, because the Chinese were engaged in a civil war. There was a lot of turbulence within China, as you're well aware, and therefore Chinese control, if you can use that word, over Tibet was extremely what shall I say? It was absent literally during that period. And therefore, when 1950 arrived, the People's Republic was established in October 1949. And one of the first things that they set out to do, the authorities, the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing set out to do, was to secure their presence in the peripheries of China, especially the western peripheries, Xinjiang and Tibet. And therefore, the Chinese PLA launched an offensive and
Mm-hmm.
entered Tibet, began the offensive against Tibet in October 1950. And by May 1951, they had signed the 17-point agreement with the Tibetans, in which the Tibetans virtually conceded to the Chinese that everything was over. It was literally a walkover for the Chinese.
And how do you think, and we're looking at that extract from your book, when you look at this 1950 point of departure, how do you think that you would join the dots from that point of departure to this moment, when even now in 2021, we repeatedly hear how Tibet is that X factor that India needs to leverage and does it?
I don't know to what extent India can leverage that factor now, to be very candid and honest.
Yeah.
In 1950, when the Chinese entered Tibet, it was famously said by Sumul Sinha, who was our man in Lhasa, if you can call it, the MEA man in Lhasa at that time. He said, the Chinese have entered Tibet, the Himalayas no longer exist. So you can
Hmm.
you can weigh those words. Every syllable, I think, tells a story. And what happened when the Chinese entered Tibet at that time? No country in the world, none of the powers, whether it was the United States or the United Kingdom, of course, the Soviet Union was an ally of China, so they could not be expected to protest against the Chinese entry. But these powers, the Western powers, and India, which had inherited, all the treaty provisions that had been in existence from 1914 onwards, which essentially gave us the McMahon Line, as you know, in the Arunachal Pradesh Tibet sector of the border, and gave us certain rights and privileges in Tibet. We did not leverage those rights and privileges. Not that we could really have been able to leverage those privileges, because we were facing the might of the Chinese army. India was a nascent nation. We had terribly complex challenges that we faced both within and on our borders, especially with Pakistan, as you know. So the question of providing resistance, armed resistance, let us say, to the Chinese entry into Tibet just didn't arise. But what we could possibly have done at that time was to lead a charge, as it were, in the United Nations when the issue came up. The Tibetans tried very hard to bring it up before the United Nations. And it was a country, believe it or not, El Salvador, that championed the Tibetan cause. El Salvador, which is at the other end of the earth from this region.
Fascinating. So
Yeah,
do you think, I mean, do you think historically we missed our moment in not raising it more strongly at the UN?
I believe we missed a moment then. We also missed a moment when the political office in Lhasa became the Consulate General of Lhasa. We gave up the rights and privileges that we had. Not that we were successors to an imperialist power. India had been very, very clear and very sensitive to ensuring that, we were a democratic country. We were a leader in the developing world. We were for decolonization. So the question of, clinging on to those rights and privileges perhaps would have been anachronistic. But when we negotiated the 1954 Trade and Intercourse Agreement with Tibet, uh, between India and China, that was a stage, that was the Panchsheel Agreement, as you know, Barkha. At that
Yes.
stage, we gave up our rights and privileges, but we didn't seek a validation of the common frontier between India and China. Because you see, the question of rights and privileges that we had in Tibet was intricately connected to the question of the border, which had been sort of finalized in 1914 between the British Indian government and the Tibetans. And that McMahon Line, we should have sought validation of it in 1954.
I was just going to ask you to talk a little bit about the McMahon line in how you would locate it in the framework of the role of the British, right? We don't talk about the role of the British often enough when we talk about India and China, or you know, indeed Tibet, which is really where this entire sort of line is first drawn out. So, if you had to tell today's audience, you know, the McMahon line is named after a Britisher. We don't even sort of, you know, remember that. We almost Indianize it to call it the McMahon line. I think if you ask most people
Yeah,
today, they think it's named after some desi. So talk a little
that's
bit
right.
about, yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Well, Sir Henry McMahon was, one of my predecessors. He was the uh, Foreign Secretary of the British Indian government, the government of India, as they called it, the government of India at that time, and he negotiated this border agreement, if you can term it such. With the Tibetan representative, Longchen Shatra, who was the Tibetan representative at the Simla conference in 1914. You see, the British, as you know, were obsessed with the question, and I think they were rightfully obsessed with the question of security of India's frontiers. They were worried about the expansionism, so-called expansionism of the Russians, before the revolution of 1917, and they were concerned about the kind of military inroads that the Chinese were beginning to make into Tibet before the revolution in China of 1911. So the conference of 1914, in which the Chinese representative was also present, may I add, and the Tibetans and the Indians, British Indian government, was essentially convened in order uh, to talk about the position of Tibet, the frontiers of Tibet, what kind of connections it would have with India. So that was really the provenance of the 1914 meetings in Simla and Delhi. In fact, the Indo-Tibetan border agreement, which resulted in the McMahon Line, came about through negotiations in Delhi. It was not negotiated with China, it was negotiated with Tibet. Now, the question arises, did Tibet have the right to transact international agreements? As far as the British Indian government was concerned, yes, they assumed and they dealt with the question by recognizing that Tibet had that right. Now, the Chinese will dispute that. The Chinese have always disputed that. But the fact is, factually, on the ground, this became an agreement which finalized the border in the eastern sector of the India-China boundary, a border with Tibet. Essentially, it was a border with Tibet. China is not, as you know, geographically, the Chinese territories were not near our border. And McMahon, Sir Henry McMahon, wanted a boundary, and all the policymakers in Delhi wanted a boundary on the high Himalaya that offered security to the Indian territory south of the Himalayan crest. And the McMahon line is essentially a line drawn on that Himalayan crest
Yeah.
on the highest watershed that exists in the area.
Ma'am, when we look at what's happening, you know, in eastern Ladakh today, and you look at the Chinese using infrastructure, the building of roads as almost like a weapon of expansionism, it was fascinating to read about how this started with the building of roads in eastern Ladakh, and how at that time, even the, you know, the highest levels of government were not kept in the loop. So can you talk about that moment and that old, in a sense, Chinese strategy, as it were, to use the building of roads in the high Himalayas as a kind of display or a flexing of muscle?
Yes, Barka, and that's why Sumul Sinha's words about the Himalayas ceasing to exist were so prophetic. The Chinese have always been big builders. There's that old Chinese story about the old man who moved mountains. They have literally been able to move mountains. And one of the first things they set out to do when they entered Xinjiang and Tibet was to improve infrastructure and to ensure connectivity with the Chinese mainland, which was not available at that time. Many may not be aware that the only way that Tibet was being supplied for the Chinese troops that were present there at that early stage in the 50s, before they built the roads, was through India. the supplies came through Calcutta and they came up to Nathula Pass and entered the Chumbi Valley. And that's how this was the main lifeline for Tibet at that time, which was why I think the Chinese wanted to talk to us about Tibet in those days, which they don't want to at the moment. So you're talking about the Aksai Chin Highway in eastern Ladakh and the fact that it was built and we became aware of it officially, at least in 1957. But I wouldn't say that we were in the dark about the highway, to be
Mm.
honest. And my book, really, my intention was to set out an honest picture about these
Yes.
problems, because unless we see through the glass properly, our vision is compromised. And therefore, we had news about the highway being constructed, that there was a road building going on in possibly rumors were being heard. And also our trade agent in Ghatok, Lakshman Singh Janpangi, who was based there, was reporting from 1955 about the existence of the road. I think at that time, our defense and security and foreign policy establishment felt that it would be too difficult to really to establish a presence in that part of Ladakh, which was extremely, as you know, hostile in terms of the terrain. It doesn't sustain population, unlike Arunachal Pradesh, where it's a totally different picture. If you look at the real estate, if you look at it in terms of real estate, I mean, Arunachal Pradesh is an extremely valuable piece of real estate territory, sovereign for India.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy that, we established our presence there in the 50s and we have not been, unseated. But in Ladakh, it's a totally different story. I mean, we can set up army encampments, no doubt, but, the distances to be covered, the hostility of the terrain, all that made it obviously difficult for India to establish a presence there and to ensure that the road was not built. So, these were situations. I mean, you have to look at the whole border between India and China as a work that was being constantly evolved through the years. You had, of course, the historical claims that both sides had, but also you had the actual presence being enforced or being established in these remote areas from the time of our independence and from the time of the establishment of the People's Republic. So you have to look at it like that, a constantly evolving situation, which has resulted in the situation that you see today.
Well, I was just going to say that, from the 1950s, when we didn't feel that we could stop the building of the road, to now, when hundreds of thousands of our troops have been compelled to stand eyeball to eyeball with the Chinese, that has, in a sense, turned full circle. Can we speak a bit about the role of Nehru, one of the most contested sort of narratives? He has been accused of far too much pacifism with the Chinese. And then, of course, the debacle of 1962 happens. One of the things that the Indian military really emphasized last year, post Galwan, was that the demons of 1962 had been buried because the military took some proactive military action, the gains of which some say may have been squandered away, but that's a different debate. When you look at Nehru, and I know that one part of your book talks about how Nehru takes this trek into Bhutan and he spends a long time while he's on this trek, thinking about the relationship with China, where it went wrong, what is possible. When you look at the role of Nehru, how does he come up? I mean, I know you've mentioned elsewhere that, look, this was a new relationship, it was an unknown relationship, but even so.
Well, I think Nehru emerges from my story, this book, as a sort of a tragic hero, almost like King Lear, and stooped at the end of the story, a sense of feeling betrayed. And I think struggling with the demons within himself, because I don't believe he blamed anybody for the debacle with China. I think he only blamed himself. And I think the truth was, something that destroyed him in the end. So it's a very tragic story. I had this view of India and China being the big two of Asia and somehow constituting a third force in world politics, because this was the world of the Cold War. You had East and West. You had the United States and its allies arraigned against the Soviet Union. And Nehru didn't want to have any part with this Cold War. And he, in fact, wanted to consolidate the areas of peace, especially in Asia, however idealistic that may have been. But you cannot fault him for that. The second point I'd like to mention is, while it's, it's, there is a whole industry that has come up that blames Nehru. It's like a textbook gospel for them.
Mhm.
But the fact is, Nehru was deep down suspicious of the Chinese. He knew that as far as the boundary was concerned, India had to consolidate its presence and ensure the security of its frontiers. But at the same time, you're talking of a frontier policy and you're talking of a foreign policy that emphasized peace, dialogue, conciliation, communication with China, the big neighbor next door. And as far as frontier policy was concerned, to the extent possible, establish posts, build roads, extend administration. I think all that was also being done. The impression is often created that India was sleeping all this time. I think that is not correct, and I have tried in my book to provide a more realistic
Where do you
picture.
think where do you think he went wrong when you say he was a tragic hero, kind of stooping to conquer, King Lear figure? Is it that he
Yeah.
read the Chinese wrong? Is it that he took key, there were key decisions he could have taken? For instance, you mentioned, not being more forceful about Tibet at the United Nations.
Yeah.
Obviously allowing the reference to Kashmir at the UN is one of those big mistakes, and the Chinese point this out to the Indians. That's the fascinating bit in your book. But when you look at Nehru, what is the fatal error you think he made with the Chinese?
I think the fatal error made by Nehru and his government was to assume that there would be no military offensive from China into Indian territory. That whatever we did, the Chinese could not have sustained such an offensive against China, was the view. And secondly, that, given this dialogue and this bilateral relationship that India and China had set up, the question of conflict really did not arise. I think that was a strategic error. That was an error, as has been called, the term used, error in the higher direction of leadership.
Yeah. Though on a lighter note, and it's a lovely little anecdote, when his sister is leading a delegation to China, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, and Mao offers her a cigarette, and she declines, being a somewhat sort of Indian groomed person. It's
Yeah,
explained to Mao that yes, of course, Indian women smoke if they wish to, but not in front of elders or those they have a
yeah.
formal relationship with. And then he insists, and it's a lovely little anecdote. So speak a little bit about that.
Yes, the wonderful anecdote, I think, about not only, the position of Indian women post independence. These were women who had fought in the independence struggle, and I've always remarked about the fact that in one generation, I mean, if you look at Indian women in the early 1900s and Indian women now in the 40s and 50s of the last century, what a change! What a sea change had come about as far as their voice was concerned, the impact that they made. You had Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was the first woman ambassador in the world to the Soviet Union and to the United States. I mean, you could say she was a political appointee. She was the sister of the prime minister. But all said and done, I mean, it was a remarkable achievement. I mean, she made a big impact in the United Nations. And when she went to China, I think she went with an open mind. She was impressed by what she saw, but there were aspects of China also that revolted her. The killings that went on of people in high places as a result of the revolution, where literally mob mentality took over. These were things I think that repelled her, but she was impressed. A lot of the people in the delegation were impressed by the progress that China seemingly had made just in 3 years after the constitution of the People's Republic. I think the anecdote about her accepting a cigarette from Mao offers a lighter,
Yeah.
story about our entire narrative. And also, I also mentioned how when she went there, the Chinese government fitted her out in a Mao tunic that she
Yeah.
wore throughout her visit. I mean, that is so extraordinary. I don't know.
It is
Today you can't.
extraordinary. Yeah.
I mean, I often say that this book of mine I'm not, tooting my horn here, but the way I've tried to write it is a set of moving pictures.
Yeah.
I've adopted a Netflix approach, let's say.
Well,
To,
well,
yeah,
let's hope it makes it to a Netflix series, because I can quite visualize, and you're absolutely right. There's so many little vignettes that actually come alive in the form of pictures and characters, and this sort of post prandial conversation over a cigarette between Mao and Vijayalakshmi Pandit is
that's
one of those
right.
moments. And
Exactly.
imagining her in a Mao designed tunic is one more. I I do have
Yes.
to close, ma'am, but I want to ask you with a question about the present. There was a point when you believed that the Prime Minister Modi had enough political capital to convert the standoff with China into a permanent settlement. That there was that opportunity, and I know you said that almost a year ago. Things have changed a lot. We now have a full-scale military build-up on either side. We have the Chinese refusing to honor the terms of the disengagement that's kind of halted mostly at Pangong Tso Lake. Do you still believe that this is a dispute that can be permanently settled and in our lifetimes? Because in some ways, the China Pakistan nexus, what has happened in Afghanistan, the fact that the Chinese were the first country to host the Taliban, that dream of an Asian century seems all but over.
Yes, Barkha, unfortunately, it is disillusioning to see the current state of relations between India and China. But however, it is also to be understood and recognized that the dialogue is continuing. Both sides are trying their best to contain the possibilities of conflict. I agree that the possibilities of conflict still stare us in the face, but there are efforts ongoing to contain it. The third point I'd like to make is that, this, if you read the history that I've written, this is such a long standing problem. And there were times, I believe, in the early phases of the relationship, even up to the early 80s, that perhaps we could have arrived at some kind of a settlement. But today it seems so much more difficult. So I think the first priority should be to allow for disengagement and de-escalation of tension in these areas. And both sides must continue their efforts. And I hope the Chinese will understand the importance of dealing with a neighbor like India. And, they are the big country today in Asia. I mean, you see the asymmetry of power. But with that kind of power comes a lot of responsibility. And the Chinese do have to show some responsibility as far as consciously making that extra move, to
Mhm.
de-escalate tensions, rather than being seen around the world, not just in India, as being quite aggressive, quite assertive, and, so completely unrelenting, let us say,
Yeah.
about consolidating their power on the peripheries of China.
Well, if ever there was an understanding of the present and the future in the past, it is in your book. It has been, especially for people who are not experts. I think that is it. This book is a travel through history for the contemporary generation, for anyone following India China. But even if you don't, even if you're not a diplomat or a journalist, it is in the end, as Nirupama just said, a veritable Netflix series with an array of fascinating characters. Thank you, ma'am. It's been a pleasure having you on the program, and congratulations on a fantastic book. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barkha. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.